All right. Hi, everyone. I'm here with Andrew Maraniss, the New York Times bestselling author of the new book, Inaugural Ballers, which just came out September 13th. It's about the first ever women's basketball competition at the Olympics, which was in 1976. It specifically focuses on Team USA, who won silver. So welcome, Andrew.
Thank you,
I,
Zach.
yeah. Um, I first wanted to ask you about Pat Summitt because I think it's so cool that we get to see her childhood in your book. So, what was the most fascinating part about telling her backstory? I know it seemed like she had a rough life, but that she always had the opportunity to play basketball.
Absolutely. And I'm speaking to you from my office at Vanderbilt University Athletic Department. So, uh, when I was a student here and just living in Nashville, the chances that I got to see her was when she was coaching the Lady Vols against my team, against Vanderbilt. And so I always respected her from a distance, but saw her as someone that was part of another team. And what was interesting for me on writing this book is she was part of my team in a way, the team that I was writing about. In 1976, she was the co-captain of the first U.S. Olympic women's basketball team. She was already the head coach at the University of Tennessee, but was a player on the team. And so in the book, I wanted to provide the backstory of a lot of these players, especially the key players on the team. And so, I did quite a bit of reading about Pat Head Summitt's early life, growing up on a farm about an hour west of Nashville, where she talked about the fact that there was no difference between hard work and work. Like you just had to get it done. Like the cows didn't care if it was raining or if it was the weekend or if it was your birthday and you didn't really want to be out there, in the barn or out in the fields working. Like you had to do it. She grew up with brothers who let her play basketball with them because there was just three of them, and they needed a fourth player to play 2-on-2. Her dad was a pretty imposing, stern, in some cases abusive figure in her life. But the one thing that he did do for his kids is he built a basketball court for them in the hayloft above their barn. And so that's where she learned to play basketball, was in this hayloft. And then also what her father did is when Pat Head was a great player as a young kid, elementary school, middle school, her high school that she was zoned for didn't have girls sports like a lot of high schools around the country. And so he actually said, well, we'll move. And they moved across the county line so that she could attend a high school that had a girls basketball team. And so she was able to further her basketball development that way, then goes on and plays at UT Martin. So this was an era before big schools like Tennessee or Vanderbilt even had women's basketball programs, really. So she played at a smaller school, Tennessee Martin, and put herself on the map nationally at some tournaments and camps, and had a chance to try out for the Olympic team in '76.
So, Pat Summitt obviously went on to Tennessee, as you mentioned. She once wrote later on in life that you change things for women by winning. So, can you just talk about all the significant changes that came about because of the 1976 silver medal?
Yeah, and she said that after watching Billie Jean King
Yeah.
beat Bobby Riggs in the Battle of the Sexes, famous tennis match, 1973, and she was really impressed with the strength, of Billie Jean King as an athlete, but also as someone that was, doing her part for women, but through sports, which was not as typical then maybe as it is today. But getting to your question, yeah, so the U.S. team won the silver medal in '76, which would be kind of a disappointment now. We always win the gold in women's basketball at the Olympics. But back then, we had finished in eighth place in the World Championships the year before, didn't qualify for the Olympics through the World Championships, only qualified at a last minute tournament that let the final two teams into the Olympic tournament. Soviets by far had the best team in the world at that time. But Billy Moore, who was the coach of the women's Olympic team, told her players before the silver medal game that if they won the game and won the silver medal, that they would change women's basketball in this country for the next 25 years. And she had seen how young girls took up gymnastics in this country and around the world after the '72 Olympics, when Olga Korbut was sort of a sensation at the Munich Olympics. And she felt that her team could do the same thing for basketball in the US, with the Olympics being played in Montreal, not far away, A lot of American media would be there. It wasn't like the games were in the middle of the night, some other part of the world, so she knew there would be a little bit of a spotlight on her team, and she felt like, that they would have an impact far beyond achieving a medal for themselves, but really show that this was a sport for girls and women as much as for men. And she was right about that. The rates of girls and women participating in basketball really skyrocketed after the 76 Olympics, in part because of their example, but also because Title IX was finally beginning to be implemented at that point in the 1970s.
You talked about how hard it was for them to qualify. Um, Speaking of that adversity, when you spoke to Billy Moore about there not being hotel rooms ready for them in Montreal,
Yeah.
could you just feel her frustration? Like even all these years later, could you feel it?
Yeah. So this team, uh, because they had performed so poorly at the World Championships, really had no expectations, even from the administration of USA Basketball at the time. They had performed well enough in the Pan Am Games after the World Championships to be invited to this last minute qualifying tournament, which was held in Hamilton, Ontario, a couple weeks before the Olympics. And the top two teams in that tournament would receive the final two bids to the Olympic tournament. USA Basketball had so little confidence that the American women would be one of those two teams. They had made no plans for the team to stay together and to live and to practice in the 2 weeks between that tournament and the Olympic tournament. All they had done was bought tickets home for the players from the qualifying tournament to wherever they lived. They assumed that they would lose and they would need to just go home. And so it turned out, because they qualified, that they had nowhere to go. There were no plans for them to stay. There was no budget for meals or hotels or anything like that. And so, yeah, Billy Moore was frustrated by it at the time, mixed with a feeling of satisfaction that they had earned their way to the Olympics. They only were able to cobble together a place to stay thanks to Kodak, the film company, which was a sponsor of women's basketball, sponsored the All-American teams back in those days, based in Rochester, New York, which was somewhat close to Montreal at least, and so they stayed in dormitories that were being renovated, had no air conditioning. This is July, and we're grateful for that. At least they had somewhere to be in the weeks leading up to the Olympics.
So they Billy Moore obviously had that situation happen with her team, and then that happens so frequently with female athletes, having kind of ridiculous living situations or situations surround outside of the game that they have to put up with, that are out
Mhm.
of the ordinary. And things still haven't become completely equal. But would you say, of the people you talked to, that was there any sense of like satisfaction with some of the improvements that have been made?
Absolutely. The women on this team felt like, they were a part of generation that did what they could, simply by playing. They had grown up at a time when they were told as young girls, and other girls were told, you shouldn't even play sports. You shouldn't build muscles. You shouldn't sweat. You shouldn't be a competitive person. That's for boys, not for you. And they resisted that messaging and became among the best players in the world. And many of them are in the Women's Basketball Hall of Fame and the Naismith Hall of Fame. So accomplished a great deal and passed the baton on to future generations to take things from there. And that's kind of the sense I got from them, is they had certain battles. Women athletes today have certain battles that, in terms of inequities between men's and women's sports, budgets, media coverage, all of that. But you can't say there's been no progress. I mean, there were no scholarships for women athletes back at the time that these women were coming along. There was no WNBA. There were no media coverage at all, and also this perception that they were doing something they weren't supposed to do just by playing. So most of that has changed, even if you see examples like at the NCAA tournament a couple of years ago, the disparity between the weight rooms and the gear and the food that were provided to men versus women, and the salary inequities like the women's national soccer team has been fighting. And so that's a message of the book for young people today. There will always be challenges. Progress is never a straight line. It's never guaranteed. Things can always backslide. And so you've got to keep fighting, but there has been change since the 76 Olympics for sure.
So I want to shift gears a little bit. In addition to Pat Summitt, there were three other players you really focused on. Told the backstories of Louisa Harris, Ann Myers, and Nancy Lieberman. So starting with Louisa Harris, you talk about all the racism she faced growing up and in college as well. And do you think that her overcoming that by having success in basketball is maybe the most socially significant subplot to the story of the 1976 silver medal?
That's a good question. It's one of the social significant subplots. I think, the one thing I try to do heavily in the book is place the story of this basketball team into the context of the women's rights movement in the 1970s, and so I think that's probably the biggest subplot of the book. But race is a part of that, absolutely. And Lucy Harris came from the Mississippi Delta, the poorest part of the poorest state in the country, dealing with just the heaviest, thickest racism that you can imagine. She grew up in the part of the state where Emmett Till was murdered, and the part of the state where Fannie Lou Hamer was fighting for civil rights and voting rights. Same part of the state where that Robert F. Kennedy visited when he was making his tour of the South in the early 60s to look at poverty in the United States. And so this is the area where she grew up. Her parents were sharecroppers. She sewed her own clothes. They had just a homemade basketball hoop in the backyard where she learned to play. Um, and she was a pioneer. She was the first Black player at Delta State University, and a pioneer in the classroom too. There weren't that many Black students at this school either. And she would sometimes ride her bicycle 20 plus miles from Delta State back home to Mentor City on the weekends, just to be comforted by her mom and her family when she was experiencing this loneliness as a pioneer on campus. But she had incredible strength just as a woman, and led her team to national championships despite the challenges that she was facing. She was the best team on the Olympic team. She's maybe not until the last year after a documentary came out about her, the Queen of Basketball, which is terrific. I don't think she was as well known as Pat Summitt or Ann Myers or Nancy Lieberman, but she was the best player on the team, the high scorer. And she also scored the first basket in the first game. So she said that was something nobody could ever take away from her. She was the first woman ever to score a basket in an Olympic basketball tournament.
And then Nancy Lieberman, no, sorry, Ann Myers first. She was obviously motivated a little bit by the fact that her brother was an NBA player and trying to get out of his shadow. But
Right.
what else did you learn about her DNA as an athlete and just her competitiveness? And I mean, she played like seven sports in
Yeah.
high school.
Growing up, she wanted to compete in the Olympics, but not necessarily in basketball. She said as an elementary school kid, she went to the library looking for books on women athletes, and at that time, there really weren't any books about women athletes except for one that she found on Babe Diedrichson. And so she thought, well, maybe I could compete in the Olympics in track and field, and that was her initial goal. And she was great at that and every other sport that she played. She was one of 11 kids. Her dad had played college basketball at Marquette, and she felt like the way that you get attention from uh, in this family was by achieving something as an athlete. Everybody was playing sports. She said her older sisters were even better than she was, but they came along earlier and really had no opportunities. She had limited opportunities, but at least there were some. But she was an example of a girl that was told by other people around her that she was doing something wrong, just by being competitive. A teacher told her, you should never beat a boy in a race at recess. That's unladylike, and boys won't like you if you're too competitive. She wanted to play with the best basketball players in her area. And as a kid, that would have meant playing on boys' teams. And she did that some, but there were parents that resented it, and they weren't concerned for her. They were embarrassed if she made their sons look bad, in these games. And so she had all of that as a backstory as she's competing eventually as a high school player. And then she receives a scholarship to UCLA, and she's the first woman to get a four-year basketball scholarship in the country.
So last question, what was it like bringing Nancy Lieberman's personality to the page and talking about how her legacy grew in Rucker Park, which is like this mecca of basketball? Like, how cool was it to tell that story?
Yeah, it was fun. And it was really fun to have a chance to interview her too. She's somebody that I've, watched and listened to from a distance over the years, but to have a chance to actually talk to her was really fun, just like it was with Ann Myers and Lucy Harris. Um, but Nancy grew up in Far Rockaway, Queens, and her mom and her grandmother, again, were disappointed that she had this interest in sports. They wanted her to play with dolls and wear dresses. Instead, she was out in the backyard playing football with the boys or baseball and basketball. And her mom actually punctured 5 basketballs that Nancy brought home so she wouldn't dribble them in the house, so she escaped on the subway, like you said, to Rucker Park, the best playground basketball in the country, or at least the iconic spot to play basketball. And she was the only girl. She was probably the only white person, playing in those games. But she earned respect from the guys there through her play. They called her Red, and they invited her to be on travel teams, with the other boys. And so she was a phenom. And when she made the team in '76, she was still in high school. She wasn't playing at Old Dominion yet. She was still in high school, and she came to the tryout camp with all the energy, of the youngest person on the team, where the other women are exhausted by these two-a-days, where the Billy Moore is running them to death. Like, she could not tire out Nancy Lieberman. She would come back to the dorm after everybody else is just plopping in the bed and want to toss a football around. Like, hey, does anybody want to go outside and play? And they're like, Nancy, just like calm down. Like, we can't do this. And so that she was
Yeah,
a fun character to write about in that sense.
for sure. Well, thank you, Andrew. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I think everyone should check out Inaugural Ballers, not just for the story of the 1976 Olympics, but for the history of women's basketball right from the beginning. So
All
I think
right.
that part of it was really cool. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Zach. This was a lot of fun. I appreciate it.